I have been a long-time lurker here, so today is my 39th birthday. I just went to lunch with my grandma and two of my teenage sons at a restaurant that I haven't been to in over 3 years. The last time I was there was with my granddad, the man who taught me everything I know. As we sat there waiting to order and eat, I kept zoning out and looking around the restaurant. Everywhere I looked, I kept seeing flashes of my grandfather. It was strange because I would see him at different ages as we had most of our private meetings at this restaurant. We have been coming here since I was 5 years old. As our dinner went on, my grandma asked me why I was so quiet. I answered that I just didn't have anything to say. She continued on with whatever she and my 2 teenage sons were talking about. When we left, I rode with them and she asked me if I was okay. I just said I was fine. It made me realize that I need to write my story down somewhere, and maybe someone who's going through what I went through can learn from it. I appreciate my granddad even more now than when he was alive, for how he saved me from myself. I recently saw this quote from somewhere that said, "What's hidden can be found, and what's protected is still protected." I didn't fully appreciate this quote until my ex-wife cheated on me and plotted with her affair partner to take over half of my real estate portfolio in our divorce settlement. When the expensive lawyers she hired realized that my assets were protected, they dropped her case faster than they took it. Her affair partner was her ex-boyfriend, and she had been allowing him to live as a tenant in my rental property without my knowledge for over 3 years before D-Day. I own multiple rental properties, most of which I inherited from my grandfather. My ex-wife helped manage the properties until we got divorced. I have a massive portfolio of apartment units that I inherited from my grandfather. These properties generate a net cash flow of 6 figures weekly. D-Day was a year ago. I was 38 years old and my wife was 36 at the time. We had been married for 13 years and had known each other for 21 years since we went to high school together. We didn't start dating until my early 20s. During high school, I was known as the rich kid because of my grandfather's wealth. He was a self-made millionaire who came from nothing. My parents passed away in a car accident when I was 4 years old, so my grandparents took me in. My granddad was a real estate investor and started accumulating properties in the 70s. 2 years after my granddad passed away, my ex-wife filed for divorce. After an employee she fired became a whistleblower and ratted her out, she filed for divorce, thinking that she and her affair partner would get half of my inheritance and the properties I acquired during our marriage. What I didn't tell her was that my grandfather didn't trust me enough to transfer over his properties until I was 50 years old. So the LLC that I bought properties under was held by an offshore trust created by my grandfather. I can't blame him for not trusting me because I was a troubled kid growing up, dealing with abandonment issues. I was a drug addict and he did not trust my judgment. He decided to hand over all his properties to an offshore trust. My granddad modified his will when I was about 24 years old, out of prison and going to rehab. That was when I got married to my ex-wife, and he wasn't a big fan of her. I wasn't aware that he modified his will until I spoke to his estate lawyer during my divorce. In my mid-20s, after I went to prison, I changed into a different person. I grew up and realized that I was wasting my life and this was my final chance. I got rid of my criminal ways and my drug habit, but I forgot to get rid of something else that my granddad didn't like. My ex-wife. I carried her over to my new life. I became close with my granddad after I got rid of my addiction and stopped getting into trouble, but he never changed his will. We acquired a lot of properties together and worked closely. Every property I bought while I was married to my ex-wife was under the offshore trust's name as an employee. I never thought about going on my own because I saw it as a family business. I knew I was going to inherit my grandfather's leftovers because I was all he had. I saw their wealth as my wealth. When we made the biggest deal in our portfolio, a 423 apartment unit in California, I was married to my wife. All transactions were done through an LLC, which is owned by the offshore trust. The offshore trust pays a salary to me and eventually to my ex-wife when she started working as a property manager. My ex-wife thought that I owned the trust. But she didn't know that it was an offshore trust. I knew, but I never thought about it like that. I didn't understand much of it either. The legal side of the business bored me, so I allowed my granddad's trusted estate lawyer to handle it. I know I am all over the place with my story, and I feel like I'm getting too far ahead of myself. So let me give you some background so you have a better understanding. I met my wife when I was in high school, but we didn't date at the time because I wouldn't give her the time of day. I was that rich kid with multiple girlfriends. I drove the nicest cars, hosted the best parties, and had access to the best drugs. Everyone wanted to be my friend. My grandmother spoiled me because my parents died in a car accident when I was 4. My father was their only son and I was their only child. My grandmother would always spoil me with expensive gifts and give me whatever I asked for. My grandfather would try to stop her, saying that she was turning me into a spoiled brat. And sure enough, he was right. By the time I turned 18, I had already accumulated a rap sheet including 1 DUI, 2 DWIs, driving without a license, drug possession, and disturbing the peace. My grandmother would always bail me out and blame the police, much to my grandfather's dismay. He basically wrote me off, but he couldn't write me out of his will. So he tried to protect me from myself by adding a maturity date to my inheritance. He had already set up an offshore trust in the 90s, after a bad experience in the 80s when he was sued by a tenant with small children. That bankruptcy forced him to start over, and he learned the hard way the importance of protecting his assets. He created an LLC and added layers of protection by placing ownership of the LLC in a trust located outside the jurisdiction of the U.S. court system, making it not subject to U.S. laws. After my wife cheated on me and divorced me, there were lawyers lining up to take her case. During the divorce proceedings, my wife's lawyer discovered that she would be worth more if she stayed married to me, as I was being paid a salary by the offshore trust. Even the house we lived in together was owned by the trust. The major deals that my grandfather and I closed before we stopped adding to our portfolio were done while I was married to my ex-wife. However, I was more of an apprentice than a business partner, and I was paid a salary regardless of how hard I worked. My grandfather lived a modest life, and the more time I spent with him, the more I became frugal like him. The decision to pay me a salary was made by my grandfather to control my spending habits. I accepted it because I wanted to change and not revert to my old ways. Before I graduated high school, my grandparents wanted me to go to college and become a lawyer. But I had different plans for myself. I was constantly in and out of juvenile detention, always partying, and not caring about the consequences because I knew my grandmother would bail me out. But then I went to prison for drug possession in my early 20s. And that was a wake-up call for me. This final time, my granddad had enough, and he refused to allow my grandma to get me out of trouble. I thought he wanted me to rot in prison, but Grandma would visit me behind his back. I had my Damascus moment in prison. I learned to appreciate the small things in life. The majority of convicts in prison didn't have the opportunities that I had, and they were surprised that I threw all that away to join them in prison. I was dealing with abandonment issues. I tried to blame it on my parents for leaving me in this world, and tried to blame my problems on others, but ultimately it was my fault. I did my time and it profoundly changed me. I finally realized that going to prison was the best thing that could have happened to me. I was able to overcome my addiction and was determined to focus and become the man my granddad always wanted me to be. I would listen to stories of other convicts who grew up in less privileged households with no support from their relatives. I had the support of my grandparents and had enough money, but I threw it all away. Their experiences lit a fire in me. I was determined to use the rest of the time I had on Earth for good, and to make my grandparents proud when I got out of prison. When I was released at 24, going to university wasn't an option for me. My granddad wanted me to join the family business. He was still unsure about me, but I was determined to earn his trust. So I went and got my real estate license. I took the exam and passed on the second try. I dedicated my time in real estate to learn as much as my granddad could teach me before he passed away. When I got out of prison, I reconnected with my ex-wife. We had known each other from high school, so we started dating. I knew some of the guys she dated in the past. She had addiction problems as well, and we bonded over that. My granddad didn't like my ex-wife and warned me about her, but back then I didn't listen. We got married when I was 24 years old. My granddad wanted me to get a prenup, but I didn't listen, and didn't see the use for it because I was in love. I thought we were going to live happily ever after. It was during that period that my granddad added a clause to his will, so I would be an employee of the trust and could only gain full ownership when I turned 50. I replaced my addiction and propensity for getting into trouble with becoming a workaholic. After my ex-wife gave birth to our son, my grandparents were forced to accept her into the family, especially my grandma. The reason my granddad wasn't a fan of my ex-wife was because she was connected to my past, and he could tell that she was very materialistic. I would later find out that he had someone look into her and found out that she was trouble. But back then, I thought my granddad was just controlling and wanted to control who I interacted with because he didn't trust me. Granddad was right. After my ex-wife gave birth, she changed into a different person, constantly nagging and spending frivolously. We were constantly at odds every time I came home. After I kicked my addiction habit, we had nothing in common. Our relationship was extremely toxic. It got to a point where I refused to go home after a busy day at work because I couldn't get a moment of peace in my house. This contributed to my becoming a workaholic. The more I became a workaholic, the more I could relate to my granddad. We became close, and I became his assistant and confidant in all his business dealings. He would buy residential and office spaces, rehab them, and flip them for profit, keeping the rest in his portfolio. All the profits were transferred to an offshore trust account. Regardless of how hard I worked, I received the same salary of about $15,000 a month. I could have asked for more, but my ex-wife would just spend it because we shared the same account. I only needed money for food, gas, and a white t-shirt and jeans, so I probably spent $1,000 a month. I completely lost track of how much my ex-wife spent, and she had free reign over my income. I had everything I wanted at the time. I had 2 beautiful sons, my grandparents were happy with me, and I was doing well and becoming a seasoned real estate investor. I had gained the trust of my granddad. The only thing I was missing was a happy wife. After our second son was born, my relationship with my ex-wife deteriorated. It got to a point where I wouldn't come home for 2 days to avoid her nagging and fighting. She had always been a stay-at-home mom until 3 years ago when she decided she wanted to work in my family business. This came as a surprise to me because I knew she didn't like to work. My granddad had told me about this before, but I refused to believe him because I had this idea that my granddad was controlling. When I told my granddad that my ex-wife was trying to work in our family business, he was skeptical. At that time, I was already taking full control of the business operations because my granddad was falling ill. So I hired her in a role on the management side of the properties. About a year later, my granddad and I stopped acquiring properties and laid off the contractors on the rehab side of the business. So I focused on managing the portfolio that we already owned. It didn't take long for my ex-wife to start playing a much larger role in the management side of the business. But our relationship was still strained. The good thing about her working was that she was out of the house, so I could come home and have peace. Our bedroom life was non-existent, and we weren't getting along well. I knew eventually that we were going to get a divorce, and I thought I would have to liquidate or give her a fraction of my portfolio if we divorced. That was why I stayed with her longer than I wanted to. I was incredibly ignorant about the legal side of my business. I understood that we had grown apart and shared 2 sons together, and when we divorced, she would receive a fraction of my portfolio. She receives a fraction of what I earned during our marriage, and I paid child support. But I soon discovered that it was more complex than that due to the offshore trust. I was not a greedy person, and I was willing to share with her so she could maintain the same lifestyle after our divorce. However, everything changed when I found out she was cheating on me and how long the affair had been going on. She had also been using my hard-earned money to pay him, which I only found out about when she fired an employee who then confided in me about a tenant staying at our property without paying rent. My ex-wife would let this tenant into her office and they would spend hours locked inside. When she told me the tenant's name, I recognized him from my high school days when I was partying and dating girls. He was my ex-wife's ex-boyfriend before we started dating, a total loser. She gave me records to prove that he had been staying at my apartment for over 3 years without paying rent. When I confronted her about him, she confessed that she allowed him to stay because I had proof. I asked her how long the affair had been going on, and she lied and said they were not having an affair. Her affair made me realize how generous I had been towards her and how she was taking advantage of my kindness. I have hundreds of apartments, so the loss of rent does not affect me. It was not about the money, but the lies, cheating, and disrespect. She used my money to go on vacations with her loser ex, which was unacceptable. Her affair was also the reason why she turned against me and made my home a nightmare. I requested an audit of all the units she managed and found out that she had been allowing her friends and relatives to stay at my property without paying rent. I immediately fired her, knowing she would try to file for divorce. And she did. Until the divorce, I rarely spoke to the estate attorney, even though he had requested to meet me several times. He was never my priority until now. I thought he just wanted to justify why we paid him every month. I am sure he had explained the offshore trust to me before, but I did not pay attention until I found out about my ex-wife's affair and when she filed for divorce. After she served me the divorce papers, I confronted her, and we got into an argument where she blamed me for losing interest in our marriage, which is why she went back to her ex-boyfriend. I knew how to push her buttons, and I said whatever I could to anger her, which caused her to confess her real plans. She started seeing her ex-boyfriend about 5 years ago. About 5 years ago, my girlfriend and I were on and off, but we became consistent 3 years ago. That was when she suddenly became interested in working for my family's business, so she could understand the business and get a share of it during our divorce. If she had done her research, she would have known that I earned a W-2 wage, and the income in our joint account was consistent with a W-2 earnings. My real estate portfolio ownership is under an offshore trust. On paper, I was just an employee who wakes up in the morning and goes to work every day. Even our home belongs to the trust. Long story short, the lawyer she hired for discovery later quit as soon as they realized my property was untouchable. The only money she received from the divorce settlement was half of the $82,000 that should have already been in our joint bank account if she had stayed married to me. Out of spite, I made sure we shared the money in my bank account, even though I didn't need it. She only received less than $35,000 after the divorce. According to my last W-2, I was making a little over 6 figures, with no retirement contribution. I had to pay child support based on my W-2 income, which was peanuts compared to my real earnings. Although I had 5 expensive cars that I had to liquidate because they were in my name, they were given to me as gifts from the trust. So I gave her 2 of the cars. Before the divorce, she had been working for 3 years as a property manager and was earning good money. She wasn't even eligible for alimony from me. Her plan backfired when she cheated and filed for divorce, thinking that she would get millions. Now she's older and approaching 40, working at a grocery store, and living off my child support payments. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Please hit the thumbs up. It won't cost you anything and it will help my channel. Thank you and have a wonderful day.